Okay friends, it's time to get started on this job. Now overall, the job itself isn't necessarily going to be the hardest. I do just want to mention that you are going to need a couple specialty tools. Typically, it's a good idea to have basic tools, but you should also have a torque wrench and a wrench that looks like this. Now this is for the timing belt adjustment. So you need to have something that can do this area right here. It's essentially going to go right into that timing chain tensioner, and it's going to make it so you can make your adjustments as needed. Now with that said, let's get into it. Alright friends, before we get going on this job, I at least want to mention that we are going to have to remove the right front wheel. So you want to make sure that your vehicle's on a flat level surface in an area that you can actually get underneath that area to be able to start working. Now before we start doing any of that, let's make our way along the passenger side front of the engine up along the top here and get into it. Now to get going, let's make our way right under here, and we're going to go ahead and open up our coolant overflow. You want to make sure that your coolant isn't hot to the touch because it could be under pressure. So we'll go ahead and turn this counterclockwise and lift it up and away from our face. We'll just give that a quick inspection. Set it aside someplace where you won't lose it. Let's make our way over to the negative battery terminal. We're going to go ahead and loosen this 10mm headed nut just enough so we can wiggle this and remove it from the battery. Let's give this a quick inspection, set it aside. Now to get started on this, let's go ahead and carefully raise and support the front of the vehicle so we can get started. Now let's make our way underneath the front of the vehicle. All along this area, you should have a nice plastic splash shield. You're going to find several mounting bolts that hold it up, making their way from each side and along the front. Go ahead and take down that splash shield. Ours is missing. The next thing we're going to do is make our way over towards the driver's side of the radiator. You're going to find where your lower radiator hose connects onto the radiator. For that, you're going to have a spring clamp. Go ahead and squeeze that clamp, carefully pull the hose off of the radiator. Keep in mind there will be coolant in this area. You need to wear hand and eye protection, and of course make sure you have a nice collection receptacle. Let's make our way over here, and we're going to come over to the serpentine belt tensioner. That's this right here. Before we go ahead and loosen this to relieve tension off of the belt and remove the belt, take quick note of the routing of the belt while it's still on the vehicle. There's pulleys that it goes over, and there's pulleys that it goes around. With that said, we can go ahead and start relieving tension. There's two ways of doing this. I'm going to use a 16mm wrench right up along here to be able to turn this. You could also use a serpentine belt tool and bring it all the way down along the far part of the tensioner. Once that's off of there, I'll just go ahead and grab onto that belt. We can pull it right off. Now we'll remove the belt from the area. Whenever you remove a belt, you always want to give it a quick inspection. Pay attention inside of all of the grooves. We're looking to see if it looks like it's torn or worn in any way. Assuming it looks good, go ahead and set it aside. Now we can continue on to removing the power steering reservoir from the area. To do that, I'm going to carefully grab onto this, and we're going to lift it up. If you were to look at the back side, you can see that it has three little nubs that come through. So once we slide it up, they're going to slide out of their locked position and into their open position, and then we can pull it away a little bit. Now we can make our way right over here, and we're going to go ahead and fully remove this 13mm headed bolt. Before I go ahead and fully remove it though, I'm going to go ahead and loosen it just a little bit, give it a couple loving bonks with my hammer. That's going to break free the other side, and then I can fully remove this. Inspect each bolt as you remove them. Now once we have that top bolt out of there, we're going to go ahead and fully remove the lower bolt as well. Once you start loosening it, you're going to notice that the alternator rocks a little bit. Let's go ahead and get this bolt out of here. We'll just rock that tensioner a little bit so we can fully remove that bolt. So now we can start wiggling around our alternator a little bit and we can start getting it away from its mounting points. But if you find it seems as though it's stuck, typically it's because along the bottom you're going to have a bushing that looks just like this one that's up along the top. The way that we pushed that out of the alternator was with that bolt. While it was still in a couple good threads, we just gave it a couple loving bonks and that drove this through, which of course made it so we can move the alternator around. With it broken free, I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto it, start removing it from the engine, and then we can start disconnecting our electrical connectors and our electrical wire mounting point down a little lower. To remove this one, you can see that there's a little tab directly in front of my index finger. I'm just going to go ahead and carefully squeeze on that and we can pull it off. Just going to squeeze that tab a little bit. Now if you wanted to, you can carefully use a small screwdriver. And we're just going to get right in between this area. Once you go ahead and press on that tab, you should be able to start pulling this away from the alternator. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, you want to give it a quick inspection. If you see any funny colors, it's corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. That looks fine, so I can go ahead and set it aside. Now let's move down to this one right here. It has a plastic cover. Go ahead and pop that off of there and then we'll remove the mounting nut. Make sure you set this aside. You will be reusing it. We'll use our 13mm to remove this. Now let's make our way to the lower part of the alternator. You're going to find an 8mm mounting nut. Once you remove that, you can go ahead and get this wiring out of the way and remove the alternator from the car. Let's put that nut back on there. Carefully remove your alternator. It's a good idea to give it a quick inspection. Make sure you don't hear any grinding noise coming from the inside. If you do, now's a perfect time to go ahead and replace this. Now we can start moving along to removing two other things. We're going to remove the serpentine belt tensioner. For that, there's going to be three 13mm headed bolts. But what you're going to find is for the two 13mm bolts up along the top, is there's a bracket that's also going to come off at the same time. So just keep that in mind. For the tensioner, what you're going to notice is as you go ahead and relieve tension from it, it's going to be spring-loaded and it's going to try to pull it back. That's a good thing, but when you're working on this and it's trying to pull back, that's going to make it difficult to remove this bolt right here and especially that one down there. With that said, you're going to have to continue with your 16mm wrench, and I also recommend having something that looks like this, which is essentially just a piece of metal. It's a little metal rod, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my wrench, come right like this, and we're going to try to align these 2 points right here. Now once that's aligned, I can take my metal tab that I made. I'm going to go ahead and slide it right on through. You can see it coming through both areas here, and that's going to lock it in place. Now we can continue on removing the rest of our bolts. With the tensioner safely locked in place, we can continue on removing our three 13mm headed bolts. You're going to find two up along the top and then one located directly underneath. Let's go ahead and remove all. I'm going to start with the lowest. Make sure you hold that tensioner. There it is, friends. Now we can start getting this cover out of the way. To do that, there's going to be two clips. You'll find one located up across the front, and then if you were to move along the back side of the cover, right up along the top, you're going to find a second. To remove these, I'm just going to use a screwdriver and come right along this back side. You can see that there's a little flippy-do. Let's go ahead and pop that off of there. We'll do the same to the back one. Let's grab that cover. We're just going to give it a little wiggle and we can remove it from the vehicle. All right, there's our cover. We can set this aside. And now we have a clear view of the top of our timing belt. Now let's safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so we can go ahead and remove the wheel. To do that, I'm going to remove all 5 of my 17mm lug studs and then the wheel. For the first one, what I always like to do is just remove it, give it a quick inspection, and then I'm going to put it back in a few good threads. Then I'll fully remove the other 4. Make sure you hold your wheel in place and then remove it. With the wheel out of the way, we have a nice clear view of the inside fender liner. We're going to have to go ahead and remove this. To remove it, you're going to find several T25 Torx screws. Essentially, they're going to look like a star. Let's go ahead and remove all of them and the plastic wheel well liner. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is take down the bolts that hold your skid shield up along this side. Ours is missing, so of course I can't show you it, but you already saw how to remove the screws. Other than that, there's going to be another one up in this corner. Let's go ahead and remove this as well. This out of here. As always, we like to give things a quick inspection. Assuming it looks good, you can go ahead and set it aside. With that out of the way, we have a nice clear view of our crank. This is the main pulley that's attached to the engine. Now we have to go ahead and remove this pulley. To do that, looking in the center, you're going to find 4 6mm Allen head bolts. Let's go ahead and remove all of them. Now at this point, you should be able to grab onto the pulley, and we're going to give it a couple little wiggles here and try to remove it from the actual shaft. Now looking at this pulley, you're going to see that you have the 4 holes that we removed all of the mounting bolts from, but you also have 2 smaller holes. Those 2 smaller holes that you can see are very important to pay attention to, because if you were to look at the crank, you can see that you have your areas that they need to line up with. There's one here, one right up there. Keep that in mind for during the installation process. Now we're going to pause in this area right here and make our way up to the bracket for our motor mount. Looking at the bottom, you can find one 16mm headed bolt. Let's go ahead and fully remove this. There we are. Now that we have this nice and loose, we can pause here. We're going to have to make our way back up top. But before we do, I want to mention that we're going to have to apply some pressure underneath the very corner of the oil pan. Typically, it's a good idea to use a jack for this because we are going to have to raise and lower the engine as needed. Now from back up top, let's continue on by removing this area right here. We'll go ahead and remove this 10mm headed bolt so we can pop this out of the way. Give that a little wiggle. Should be able to pull this out. Now let's move over to the coolant reservoir. We're going to have to go ahead and get this out of the way. To do that, let's start with the electrical. For this, right where my index finger is, you can see a little tab. Go ahead and squeeze that. We'll pull this out of the way. Quick inspection. Now let's move along this way. I'm just going to go ahead and pull this up and out of its mounting positions. Now if you were to look down in the back corner of each side of this, you're going to find a T25 screw. Go ahead and remove the pair. We can grab onto this. I'm just going to go ahead and set it aside. And now we have more clear access to our mount. Now up along the top of this mount, we have to remove this bracket right along here first. Let's do that now. We'll use a 13. Remove that bracket, inspect it, set it aside. Now we can start dismounting the mount from the body. You're going to find 2 16mm headed bolts. There's one here and one just behind it on the other side. Remove the pair. Now with those 2 bolts out of the way, let's move along to this area of the bracket. For these 2 bolts, you're going to use an 18mm. Now we can grab onto this entire assembly and go ahead and pull it right out of the way. We can set that aside. Now with that mount out of the way, the next thing we want to do is have a peek inside of the wheel well. In here, you're going to see that you have this little cutout, and then if you were to look deep down inside there, you can see the engine. What I want to do next is carefully start adjusting the engine either up or down until I can line up with my mounting bolt. Now let's go ahead and take our 16 millimeter with an extension and we can remove that bolt. Now we can remove our final bolt. That's going to be located in this hole right here. You can tell that this is going to be directly in the way. Let's go ahead and adjust the height of our engine so we can access that mounting bolt. Now with the engine jacked up, we can go ahead and remove that with our 16 millimeter. All right, now keep in mind there's nothing holding this bracket in. Just hold on to that while you fully remove that bolt. It's a nice long one. Go ahead and grab that bracket. We'll get it out of the way. Set it aside. Now we can start removing our lower timing belt shield. For this, you're going to find 5 T27 bolts. Start up here along the top. All right, that one's nice and loose. You can move along. Grab that shield, carefully remove it. We can set that aside. So now that we have all that shield out of the way, we have a nice clear view of the entire timing belt area. Before you want to go ahead and take off the timing belt, it's important to make sure you pay attention to the timing marks. Up along this top area right here, what you want to pay attention to is a little itty bitty line right along the side. Now I marked mine in yellow so you can have a nice clear view of it. But yours might not necessarily be in this position. It could be anywhere along this area. So just go ahead and take a look along the side, try to find that line, and then mark it with something that you can easily see. Now once you have that marked, the next area that you want to pay attention to is right along the engine. Now right on the engine, right on this cover right here, you can see a couple letters and you can see a down arrow. That arrow needs to be lined up perfectly with the line that you found on the cog. Now to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a 19 millimeter ratchet wrench. You can also use a socket, but it needs to be a 12 point. We're going to come right down to the bottom pulley, which is where the crank pulley was, and we're going to go ahead and turn that shaft, and we're going to pay attention up here to try to get this to align. All right, so right along this area here, you can tell that I have my arrow lined up with the line that's on this cog. Now this part's something that I'm going to call your prerogative. I always like to mark the lower area as well. So all I'm going to do is find a reference point. You can tell right along this area, it has this. And then we can just draw a nice straight line down to the closest area that it would connect to into this area. Once you have it fully marked, we can continue on to our tensioner and start relieving tension. Now we can start moving our way over to the tensioner area. Now for the tensioner, looking at this area where my index finger is, you can see an arrow. But also, on either side of the arrow, there's two little dots. That's going to be super important because there's a special tool that you need for that to make your adjustment and apply tension to the belt before you go ahead and tighten this up. But also, up inside this area, there's another thing that you want to pay attention to. That's a little bit harder to see, so I'll show you on the new one. Now for this right here, what you're going to notice is if you were looking inside, this area would be lined up perfectly right there. So essentially it'll look just like that. Now once you go ahead and loosen this up, what you're going to notice is this goes like that. And then that of course is going to take off the pressure from the timing belt, and you'll be able to move it around and eventually be able to remove it. Now we're going to be extremely careful not to try to turn this belt in any way. We do not want to turn any of the cogs. Super important. Let's get that nut off of there. Now we can start sliding the belt and everything off at the same time. There we are. Let's go ahead and take this right off of here. Now we can start sliding the belt and everything off at the same time. There we are. Let's go ahead and take this right off of here. Now once you have the belt off of there, you want to give it a good inspection. Looking at the back of this one, I can see that I have a whole bunch of little cracks all over it. Now obviously this isn't something that I'm going to want to put back into the car because you saw exactly how much labor it took to get it out of the way. It only makes sense to go ahead and replace it while you have it off. We can go ahead and grab onto that tensioner. There it is, friends. Okay friends, now it's time to install our brand new timing belt tensioner. Now the area that you want to pay attention to is this area right here. You can see that it kind of protrudes out towards the rear of it. Looking at the engine, you can see that there's a little carved out hole right here. That tab needs to fit into the carved out hole, and of course the stud needs to go through the center hole of the tensioner. There we are. I've got it going right into the hole there. This is pressed directly up against here. We'll go ahead and start the nut on there, a couple good threads. Okay, now it's time to go ahead and get this water pump out of here. You're going to find 3 10mm headed mounting bolts. There's one here, one up there, and then one directly underneath it. Let's go ahead and remove all 3. I'm going to start with the hardest, down bottom. Last one. Now that we have all three of those mounting bolts out of there, let's continue on to removing this shield right up along here. If you go a little bit further up, you're going to find a 13mm headed bolt. Go ahead and remove it. We'll give that shield a quick inspection. Set it aside. Now we can start removing the water pump from the engine. Keep in mind, there could still potentially be coolant behind this area, so just be very careful. Just going to start rocking it back and forth and gently pulling it away. A lot of times it gets held up by the O-ring gasket in there. There we go. I'm just going to let that finish draining. There we are. Go ahead and carefully pull that out of there. There it is, friends. Now inside this hole right here is where that O-ring gasket's going to sit, so it needs to be free and clear of any debris. So typically I just use a little bit of sandpaper. I'm just going to make my way right around the whole entire thing. Make sure it's nice and smooth. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the outside of the engine, the areas that the water pump bolts directly against. Let's go ahead and sand that down as well. Go ahead and clean up your mess. Okay, now it's time to get ready to install our brand new water pump. Before we do, you want to make sure you put your O-ring on there. That goes into this groove right along here. Go ahead and put this right over everything. Make sure it's in the groove all the way around, and then once it is, make sure you coat it with a thin amount of that coolant. You can go ahead and take a little bit right out of the engine and just rub it right along the entire O-ring to lubricate it. Now we can go ahead and take our water pump and get it in position. When you put your water pump in, you want to make sure that it's in this position right here. So you have this facing down. Here we are. Once you have it pressed all the way up against the engine, let's go ahead and grab onto our mounting bolts and our shield. Start these two lower bolts in. Now it's important to make sure that you do not tighten any of these mounting bolts until you make sure that all of them are started in. Before we put in the top bolt, let's make sure we grab that shield and get it in position as well. Now this shield needs to fit directly in here just like this. You can tell that I have the bottom hole lined up and of course my top hole lined up as well. Now we can torque each of these three bolts to 11 foot-pounds. Once those are torqued, you can make your way up here to the top bolt for that shield. Make sure this one's nice and snug. All right, so now the next thing that we're going to want to do is make sure that we clean everything down. It's very important to make sure that you don't have any dirt or debris inside any of your pulleys, especially along the cogs where the belt is going to ride. Before we go ahead and put on our timing belt, it's very important to make sure you do not have one single drop of coolant inside this area. You'll notice when we went ahead and took out the water pump, a lot of coolant made its way down, and of course it's going to sit down along that crank pulley area. Make sure there's no coolant in the area. Okay, now it's time to install our timing belt. Now before we go ahead and start putting this on there, just double check your marks. You want to make sure that the cam pulley is still lined up with its corresponding mark on the engine. Down along the bottom, we also have our mark that we made. Want to make sure that's lined up as well. And then we can take the belt and start putting it on. Now when you go to put the belt on, it's going to be easiest if you go ahead and carefully take the tensioner away from the engine a little bit. We're going to go ahead and start putting the belt on and sliding this on at the same time as the belt itself. I'm going to go right down along that bottom gear. Now when I put this on, I'm only going to go approximately halfway up the belt. So you can tell how thick the belt is. We're only going to put it on about halfway on each of these pulleys, and then we can just continue sliding it on once it's in position. Get that in there. Okay. All right. Now let's go ahead and slide the belt on. Now here's a pause point. Once again, we need to make sure that we're still in the fully aligned position, up along the top and down along the bottom. Also, you want to pay attention along the front of the timing belt itself. This part right here should be under some tension. What I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and take that bottom crank pulley and I'm going to go ahead and turn that clockwise a little bit until it feels like it's under tension. If it seems like it loosened, I'm going to go ahead and turn it counterclockwise a little bit. All right. So now I'm just going to double check to make sure everything's lined up. So now that I have the belt on all of the pulleys, we're going to go ahead and pay attention to those markings again. We have our marking down along the bottom. You can tell it's perfectly aligned. We'll make our way up to the top. Once again, perfectly aligned. And then lastly, you just want to make sure you have tension along the front area of the belt right here. So as you can tell, I can go ahead and grab onto this and I can move it just a little bit. If you can take this belt and go like that, then that means that you're off by one tooth on the belt. If you're going to have any slack from this belt at this point, it needs to be on the back side. Just a quick note, if you are finding that you're having an issue trying to get it so it was taut along the front with everything lined up, what you would want to do is make sure that the belt is not inside the cogs right here. We're going to go ahead and turn this counterclockwise just till one notch lines up with its mark. So essentially where we are now is lined up. We're going to go ahead and take it to the very next notch. So once that one's lined up, we can slide everything together. Then we can turn this clockwise. That'll apply tension, double check to make sure everything's lined up, and then we can move along to that tensioner. Now I'm just going to make sure this pulley is pressed in as far as I can, and I'm going to go ahead and snug this just by hand. The next thing we need to do is take this area right here, and we're going to go ahead and turn this counterclockwise, and while we do that, we want to be paying attention along the back side of this pulley. You remember those two little tabs that I talked to you about? We want to go ahead and spin this counterclockwise until they line up. Once they do, tighten your 13mm nut. Now to make this adjustment, we're going to have to go ahead and use our special tool along these two prongs right here. And then once we have it properly adjusted, we're going to go ahead and tighten this up. But to be able to find out where the proper adjustment is, you'd have to look along the back side of this. Essentially, there's going to be a single tab. You're going to go ahead and turn this counterclockwise. It's going to bring that up into the proper position where you can see it's lined up with its corresponding slot. right, that looks pretty good. Go ahead and snug this up. Now, before we continue on by tightening this down completely, let's just give this a triple check. Once again, we're paying attention to all of our alignment points. The bottom one, the center, and all the way up along the top. Assuming all three look good, we can continue on by tightening that nut. Now we can torque this nut to 15 foot-pounds. Once it's torqued to that, let's take an additional 45 degrees. All right, so now that we have the belt on there and the tensioners in place, we're going to continue on by turning that crank with our 19mm wrench several times. What we want to do is to have everything come around at least 2 times, and then we're going to try to realign everything. What we're trying to do is to make sure after we go around several times with the engine, everything is still lined up in the end. So let's go ahead and turn this over a few times with the wrench, and then we'll double check. All right, so we're coming up on it here. Let's try to get that as close to lined up as possible. Now let's check our other marks. Looks like it needs to go a teeny bit more here. There we are. Now that we've cranked it over several times, let's continue on by checking all of our marks. The bottom, the middle, and all the way up at the top. Assuming everything looks good, we can continue. All right, let's keep rolling. We've got our 2 lower shields here. We're going to start with the lower one here. Once that seems like it's in place, we can start in the 2 lower bolts, and then we'll go ahead and put this top one on. Once that's in place, we can finish off putting on all the rest and then snug all of them up. Now we can get this engine bracket back in here. Generally, I like to keep this lower bolt still inside of the bracket. There we are. Now we can take our 2 other mounting bolts. Looking at the bolts, you can tell that one is clearly longer than the other. The longer one is going to be the forward bolt. Go ahead and start that in a few good threads. Once again, we're only starting in our mounting bolts. Once they're all started, we can snug them up. Now let's get that second one through this hole in the wheel well. There we are. Now with both of those started, I'm just going to reach from along the bottom here, start in this last one. Okay, snug them up. Make sure that's nice and tight. Now let's get that second one through this hole in the wheel well. Get my head out of the way in one sec. All right, now we can go ahead and get this mount back in here. You want to pay attention to the 4 bolt holes that you have on it. Let's go ahead and rest this into place, lining up all 4 of our bolt holes. 2 of them are going to line up with the body, and then the other 2 need to line up with this area of the engine. Now, once I have this set into position, the next thing that I always like to do is just either raise or lower the engine so this is sitting flush and everything's making contact. In my case, I need to go up a little bit. Now that it's making contact, let's have a look at our 4 mounting bolts. You can see that these 2 are a little larger than the other 2. The 2 larger bolts are going to go closest to the engine. Go ahead and start these in by hand. Once we have those started, we can take our other 2 bolts and we'll go ahead and take them through the mount right into the body. All right, so now we can go ahead and bottom out each of the 4 bolts. And now we can torque each of them to manufacturer's specifications. Now let's start with torquing the ones that go into the body itself. We're going to torque these to 40 Newton meters, and then we need to continue on an extra 90 degrees, so essentially a quarter turn. All right, so there's my 40 Newton meters. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this the extra 90 degrees. Now once it's torqued to the 40 Newton meters, let's go ahead and take it 90 degrees. There we are. Now we can do these larger bolts. For these, we're going to torque them to 60 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. Now we can install this bracket. Looking at it, you can see that it has this curved up area. That's going to go from right here on the mount, straight across, and then curve up. Let's get that in place. We'll take our 2 mounting bolts, start each of them in. Once they're both started, we can go ahead and snug them up, torque them to 20 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. Now let's take that an additional 90 degrees. Let's get this back in place. We'll take our mounting bolt, start it in there, and go ahead and bottom that out. Now we can get this cover back on here. For the cover itself, you want to carefully try sliding it down in between where the timing belt is and that engine mount. We'll go ahead and slide it down into position, and then we can latch it in place. Now we need to look down along the bottom as we do this. Looking here, you can see that I have a little flippy-do. That needs to slide in and underneath the bottom cover. So I'm just gonna go ahead and take it, I'll push it a little bit, and you can tell that it just curled right behind there. Now I'm gonna do the exact same thing to the backside. Once I do, I can press this up against the engine and latch it in. There we are. Go ahead and slide that right on there. We'll clip this one in as well. Give it a little wiggle. You want to make sure this is completely secured. You don't want any dirt or debris making its way inside where that timing belt is. Super important. Let's get the coolant reservoir back in position. Looking down along the body, you can see the two mounting points where those two mounting screws need to mount. Let's go ahead and take this and we'll put it in position. I'm going to slide it into this area. There we are. That one started. Once they're both started, go ahead and snug them up. Now we can start reattaching everything. You want to make sure that there isn't anything loose and rattling around anywhere. Let's get this into position. Reconnect in your wiring harness. Now let's start carefully taking this down. I'm just going to lower down my jack a little bit. Okay friends, now it's time to install our serpentine belt tensioner. Now we're going to go ahead and take this and put it down near being into position. Once we have it looking like the bolt holes are lined up, we also need to take this bracket. That bracket is going to slide right over the outside of each of those bolt holes. Once you have all those holes lined up, go ahead and start in your upper two bolts. Now that those are started, I'll do my lower bolt. With all three bolts started, we can go ahead and tighten all of them. Now let's just double check, make sure they're all tight. Now it's time to install our alternator. We're just going to go ahead and put it down near the position that it needs to be located in for the installation. Now once you have it down here, we're going to continue on by putting on our mounting nut on the back here. We also have our wiring. We're going to connect that. And then of course we can remount it to the engine. So now that we have that started on there, I'm going to continue on to reconnecting my other wire. Snug them up. Keep in mind when you're tightening this, it's a very small stud. It only needs to be snug. Tighten this one as well. Okay, it's bottomed out. Make sure it's nice and snug. Let's move up to here. We'll reconnect our wiring harness. Press it in, listen for a click. Give it a little tug to make sure it's 100% secure. Now double check everything, make sure it's completely secured, and then you can start remounting your alternator to the engine. Sometimes to line up the top bolts, you just have to grab onto the reservoir bracket, not the reservoir itself, and you're just going to want to give it a little tug forward and backward until this bolt can force through it. There we are. I can go ahead and start that in a little bit. Let's do the lower bolt. Wiggle that alternator around, should want to fit right in there. Once both of them are started, you can go ahead and start snugging them up. Make sure they're nice and tight. Now let's make our way back into the wheel well and start snugging up the rest of this bracket. Let's make sure it's tight. Now we can start reinstalling our harmonic balancer. Now you can tell looking at one side of it, you can see a little bit of the cogs. That essentially tells you that that's going to go directly up against here. Now also looking at this, you remember when we removed it, you had the 4 bolt holes, but then you also had 2 other mounting holes. Looking at the crank, you can see the exact area where all of your holes need to line up. Put this pulley back in the original position and then start in all of your mounting bolts. Now we're going to torque each of these to 7 foot-pounds. Now that we have them torqued, we need to take each of these bolts an additional 45 degrees. which is essentially an eighth of a turn, half of a quarter. When you do this, what you're probably going to notice is that the harmonic balancer wants to turn on you. So all I would want to do is come right up here to the center bolt with a 12.19 millimeter socket right along the outside. I can hold that still with the reverse position and go ahead and turn this in the clockwise position to finish torquing it. There we are. Okay, so let's pause down here and make our way back inside the engine compartment. We're going to go ahead and put on that serpentine belt, and the reason why we want to leave this shield off is so we can have a nice clear view of the pulleys when we're done to make sure we're completely situated. Let's get our serpentine belt installed. We're just going to go ahead and take this and we're going to bring it all the way down to the bottom around that harmonic balancer that we just installed. Once you have it on there, we're also going to go along the forward bottom pulley. Now for the center pulley along the front, the AC compressor, we actually need to go around the other side of the pulley. So I'm going to grab it and I'm going to bring it right along the rear side of that. Okay. So now we should be able to bring this right up and over the alternator. Before you go ahead and apply tension on this by removing that lock pin, go ahead and inspect it and make sure it's sitting inside all of the grooves as needed. All right, let's get our splash shield back up in here. We're going to start lining up some of our bolt holes. We're only going to start each of them in. Once all of them are started, we can go ahead and snug them up. With all the wheel well ones done, let's go ahead and snug them. That one right there on ours is broken. We can make our way underneath the corner here. We'll start putting in these bolts. Let's make our way back over to the lower radiator hose and connect that onto the radiator. Slide the clamp down into its original position to lock it in. Give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Clean your mess. All right, so now after this, you can go ahead and put on the rest of your skid shield, assuming you have it. Let's get the wheel back up on here. Line up all of your lug stud holes. Go ahead and start them all in, then we'll bottom them out and torque them to manufacturer's specification. Now with the wheels safely back down on the ground, we can torque each of our lug nuts in a crisscross manner to 89 foot-pounds. Torqued. Of course, if you have your hubcap, you want to make sure you insert that now. Now it's time to reconnect our negative battery terminal. When you do this, you want to make sure you press it down as far as you can right up against that battery so it's making the most amount of contact. Go ahead and tighten up your 10mm nut. Once you feel as though it's tight enough, go ahead and give it a wiggle to make sure it's completely secured. Now it's going to be time to go ahead and fill up our cooling system. Now, what I typically do is I use a specialty tool to go ahead and fill this. It's going to apply vacuum, and that way there I know I have a leak before I go ahead and fill it with anything, and then I have to go ahead and drain it and fix that leak. If you don't have a specialty tool, you can just go ahead and start adding right through here. Essentially, you're going to want to make sure that you have it up nice and high. You're going to run the vehicle for a little while, and it's going to start burping out the air in the system. Essentially, you're going to see a whole bunch of little air bubbles. As you see air bubbles coming up, fluid's going to be making its way down. So you need to make sure you keep checking that fluid level and make sure it's up to par. I'm going to get my tool on here, create some negative pressure. Now, once I have my hose off of there, I'm going to go ahead and watch this gauge. I want to make sure it doesn't start dropping down. Especially, I want to make sure it doesn't leave the green and move into the yellow or even worse, red. Now, when you fill your coolant system, it's important to make sure you use the proper coolant. Now, for us in particular, we just go ahead and use one that's available for pretty much every vehicle. It works for all vehicles. But what you also need to pay attention to is whether or not it's pre-mixed or full strength. If you're using concentrated coolant, make sure you mix it 50-50 with distilled water. Okay, so now at this point, we're going to go ahead and start this up and we're going to run it for a little bit. Once again, we're watching for any air bubbles to make sure they make their way out of the cooling system. Now that we ran it for a couple seconds, let's just double check that serpentine belt. That looks good. All right, so at this point, we went ahead and we ran the vehicle for a little while. We waited till we had plenty of heat coming out of the vents and our front cooling fans turned on. Essentially, that means that the thermostat is in the fully open position, and it, of course, would have let out any air that might have been in the system. So now you just want to double check to make sure you're up to the maximum line on the reservoir. After that, go ahead and take that cap, put it back in place, Once everything's put back together, go ahead and close the hood and take it for a road test. Thanks for watching. Okay friends, we got the car put back together. What's left to do now? Now typically you're going to want to go ahead and take this for a nice long road test. While we're on a road test, we want to make sure that we still have plenty of power coming from the engine, and of course there's no funny noises. Aside from that, thanks for watching.